because you don't know everything. It's about just understanding, taking the time. But also, I think what's really, really important in terms of that imposter syndrome and then kind of building that ego or putting ego to the side and building that credibility internally in yourself.
Welcome to the Soundboard with Tofe podcast. To the industry leaders and forward-thinking companies, this is your resource to become a better podcaster. You'll be taken on a journey to learn tips and tricks around podcast strategy and curation. And here's your host, Tofe Evans.
G'day. Welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, I interview Andrew Tran. Now, Andrew is also a Brizzy guy, but now he's based in Vietnam. He has quite the presence on LinkedIn, and that's usually how I find anyone because that's the social media I'm hanging out on the most. And what I came to notice about Andrew is he's got quite an extensive background in marketing and digital. I then came to find out he is the host of his own podcast called The Point of View, and that's where he interviews branding, marketing, and sales experts. If I were to tell you what I had taken away that was very valuable about the conversation I got with Andrew, the first one comes from storytelling, right? And that's a big thing that we hear about today, especially in marketing. But how do we storytell from a brand perspective? And where do businesses go right and wrong with this? Another key takeaway I got from this is there a process around coming up with topics to talk about when you're interviewing subject matter experts? You could be in this position where your podcast or a podcast that you're looking to create is about interviewing other people. And if those other people are people with credibility or they've got some sort of expertise, what is the process around coming up with the topics to speak with them? And then the last key takeaway that I want to touch on is his experience dealing with imposter syndrome as an expert when interviewing these guests, right? There can be an element of comparison, or the term imposter syndrome usually comes in when we call ourselves an expert. Because if we think we have to know everything, then there's this overwhelming anxiety, right? So I talked to Andrew about this. So before I go into the episode, please follow or subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already. Please share this. That's how you can support me. And enjoy the episode with Andrew Tran. So Andrew, I first came across your work on LinkedIn, and that's usually how I come across any sort of my guests because that's the social media I'm hanging out on the most. And it got me curious about you. Like I had seen some parallels with what I'm about, especially from a company branding standpoint, and noticed you've had quite an extensive background in marketing and digital. And as I dived deeper into your work and did a bit of research, I had noticed that you want to make a positive impact, especially for these businesses that is stemmed around customer experience. So my first question is, because you've identified a problem around that, what have you found is actually causing terrible customer experiences?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Tofe. And for anyone who's watching or listening, one of the things that causes these issues is a misalignment. Typically, if it's a small, we break it down between small and large businesses, right? So for small businesses, the misalignment, and it all stems from the customer, but the misalignment is that there's not enough research being done by the owner or the small business. So it's all anecdotal type of feedback or research that they feel is happening with their product or service. For a larger company, a larger organization, one of the biggest problems is that internal misalignment. So you might have multiple teams and multiple organizations. And because it's now more of a people-driven type of organization, you're going to find that a lot of companies are going to have issues with managing people and then managing the expectations within internally in order to kind of drive that singular point or vision coming out. It's a little bit easier if you're a small business because, if you're a small business of 10 to 20, then it's a lot easier to herd or get to that singular point. But when you have multiple big, large organizations with multiple teams, multiple business units, does get a little bit harder, but the principles are still the same. And that's what I see as the major issue when it comes to, that kind of brand misalignment is really the internal element coming through.
Yeah, that's so interesting. A lot of what I hear from that is brand alignment, misalignment, whatever we want to call it from, is what they're doing from an online presence translating into an offline presence too. And I think a big element to that is storytelling. And I know it's something that you talk about. I think you call it creative storytelling. I think I'd seen on your LinkedIn profile. It's like an aspect that you can get involved with. From a brand perspective, what have you seen companies do right and do wrong from storytelling?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Toph. So one of the things I see brands do really well when it comes to storytelling is they spend a lot of their time really understanding the type of audience that they're trying to have a relationship with, whether or not it's trying to have a relationship with, the up and coming Gen Zs to your baby boomers. Like each different generation has a distinct pattern or distinct kind of behavior that they are more attracted towards. And from a creativity storytelling point of view, there's these certain nuances that we have. So if you take like a simple storytelling element, there's, your introduction of characters, your conflict, and then your resolution. It's still the same principle, irrespective of which generation you're at. But when you start to dig deeper and understand, okay, what type of characters does a Gen Z reflect or relate towards versus someone who's a Gen Y or a Gen Z? And then it's like, what type of conflict do people in those kind of generations, feel towards? Then you're able to kind of craft that story along the lines of that. And I think that is one of the key things that I see brands do really, really well. And like, Apple, I know everyone talks about Apple being a brand that is a bit drowned out, but it's so true. You look at some of the product lines that they have, and yes, it's geared towards a younger audience, but then if you see some of the adverts or some of the communication pieces that they have for like older, accessibility type of products or accessibility type of features that are geared towards a little bit older generation, you see like the introduction of how they introduce these characters and how it relates back to the target audience, the conflict that they're trying to face, how that's relatable back to the audience, and then how they resolve it, and the joy and the emotion that kind of plays out. It's actually quite innovative or quite intuitive in the way of which they have kind of gone about that. And then you've got like young brands now, like, when you start looking at like Gen Z, they start looking at TikTok. So a lot of people who are watching or listening your podcast or your program, they're starting to look at like, okay, how do we do TikTok advertising? And then how do we build a story around that? But the problem is that when you focus too much on the singular digital channel as the distribution, sometimes, unless you are very clear as to what exactly your product or service is and who it is exactly targeted towards. So the more, the more narrow the approach, the easier it is to then dictate which channel you want to focus your energy on, your time and resources on. The larger the company, the more breadth of products and services that you offer, then the more you got to actually start to spread out. So that's one of the kind of good things that I see brands do, like your Apples, your Nikes and stuff. Brands that kind of a little bit all over the place. They try to focus on one channel, but they're not necessarily getting it because their personality or their communication doesn't come across, and it doesn't resonate. So the keyword is resonate. It doesn't resonate towards that target audience on that particular platform. So really understanding the audience that you want to target relative to your product or service, and then relative to how you want to communicate. And I guess to take a put, like there's a guy that I interviewed on my podcast called Vin Jiang, and he uses the word vocal archetypes, which is just another fancy way of saying, putting on a persona. And you're not being fake, you're being real, but you're communicating in a way that helps your audience relate back to you.
Is there a thing with being too real? And the reason why I want to ask that is because I have a bit of a background in mental health advocacy. And there are times where I feel like that can hold me back by actually saying what's on my heart on my sleeve. But there are times where I feel like, oh my gosh, I'm sharing too much. From a brand perspective, there is, I don't like using the word authenticity. Maybe I should change it to integrity because it's word is bond here. Is there ever a time where a brand can't actually share too much for transparency, or do you feel that's actually better for the brand?
I think that's better for the brand. If you're talking from a social media perspective, so if people watching or listening, they're like, oh man, like how do I, not game, but just how do I perform better on my social media platforms? What I have found working through my clients and doing audits on their kind of social platforms and their social channels is that actually the posts that do well, and that's obviously depending on which social platform that we're using. So it really depends on that. But what we're seeing is that a lot of posts that are more heartfelt, more personal, actually resonate better and actually perform a lot better. So to say that, you might overshare, like over the top share, and might be a detriment, I don't think is the case. I think if you, I can't think of something off the top of my head, but I think if you overshare, it becomes a detriment is when when what you're sharing becomes so damaging that potential clients might see it and go, oh, do I really want to work with that person? Or do I really want to use that service or that product if I know that that person or that product, that service is going to, blow up in front of my face? How does that damage me in terms of my brand reputation as a client or as a customer? But I think that's really, really rare. I think for most brands, being authentic is having that integrity is really, really important. There might be times where oversharing might be a bit too much, but I think transparency to a level of degree where if it's too transparent and it doesn't add value. So I think the important word is value in this case. Like if it doesn't add value to your target audience, then it might be considered as oversharing.
Yeah, and you could probably tie that in with resonance as well. Like that's how people would get value in this case. Like there's an emotional connection, and then that's how that's how storytelling, I feel, is it allows us to connect. It allows us to put into people's shoes. Because you're originally a Brizzy boy, but now you're based in Vietnam, and with the clients that you're working with from maybe the more from in a Vietnam standpoint, are you noticing that there's similarities with your marketing approach, or is it actually on the opposite side?
It's a little bit different. So if we're looking like between like say developed world versus developing world, Vietnam being in that developing world and say Australia being in that developed world, you're going to see that there is a better appetite in Australia, in New Zealand, in the US for services that offer consultancy or advice because we pay for it. We understand that talking to a specialist actually is worth it, and it's worth that dollar. It might cost a little bit upfront, but then you're going to make up for it towards the end, right? Whereas here in Vietnam, because it's not necessarily a country in Asia or Southeast Asia that dictates certain behavioral and economic trajectory, like Singapore is, for instance. So you're seeing Vietnam more as a you're seeing Vietnam more as a production arm. So they might get the direction from Singapore, and all they're really supposed to do is just kind of translate it and then push it out. So that's the main difference. So for Vietnam, for instance, like for me here in Vietnam, working with brands here has been a little bit more production based because it's just right now it's a bit too early. Unless you're one of the big four consultancy groups, it's a little bit hard to kind of establish yourself as a consultancy agency or consultancy group here, just because they don't really pay for it. And it's just a different mentality. But it's totally okay because Vietnam is like, I knew that coming in to Vietnam. I knew that coming into like Southeast Asian nation that these things were going to happen and that what I do is going to take time. So I'm spending this time really just educating the market, educating my prospects, educating the people. And, you know, Vietnam is actually a really not cool country. Like they have this insatiable appetite to want to learn, to want to grow, to want to get out of their situation. Like they, you know, like Vietnam's not stupid. Like they know that they're in a situation where, oh, we should be like at a higher level. We want to be able to, you know, move up in the world. But there's got to be ways of doing it. So there's this constant grind. And they work hard, man. They work really hard. Is it effective? I don't know, but they definitely work hard.
Yeah, I've been to Vietnam and I found that myself. It's sometimes I feel they're actually more developed in Australia, like internet, for example.
Yeah. There's a lot of things like there are some, it's so funny with Vietnam and in Asia in general. So if you think about just Southeast Asia in general, there are some things that are actually much more advanced than the West. So I'll give you an example, man. So like we use WhatsApp and China, as anyone who's watching or listening knows, like over the last 10 years, like everyone in China uses WeChat, right? And WeChat does everything. It's their messaging, it's their call. You can use it for payment. So Vietnam has their own. It's called Zalo. And it was actually I think it was partly developed by Chinese, by WeChat, and then the government just took over it. But it operates exactly the same. So you can transact and do everything on your phone. You can pay for things on your phone, which is so cool. So right now with Vietnam, they're trying to move away from the kind of like physical dollar, like, you know, payment kind of system. And they're trying to kind of just upgrade itself and kind of move towards more like a anti-cash type of element. So you have like credit card systems that and payment systems. So people use wallets now to pay for everything. I haven't gone to a service station or a convenience store to actually pay for my phone in a while. I just all pay for it through my apps and everything. So it's quite integrated, which is kind of cool. But then there's like some really backward stuff that Vietnam does. And you just like, from a business point of view, you're just like, come on, man, like, are you serious? But from the kind of adoption of various social or digital products, like, man, Vietnam actually does really well. And obviously, like, as you know, like traveling in Asia, and as everyone who's watching or listening might know, when they travel through Asia, like QR codes is king in this kind of part of the world. And so it's so ingrained in everything that we do. It's kind of cool.
There's a word that you used before, and it comes down to patience. And it's like they're being patient with it, but they're also experimenting and innovating, and which is a bit of a segue into podcasting, no pun intended. And I find podcasting is a very patient game. And after seeing your own podcast, it was interesting how I think you've done close to 60 episodes, and you started probably around 2020 or 2019. And with yours, you're interviewing a lot of subject matter experts around branding, marketing, I think even sales and leadership. What I think was originally yourself, and then you started interviewing these guests. And it's something I'm naturally curious about, and for the audience as well. I find a lot of people in the space we're in, we're coming up, we want to interview people who have essentially credibility and expertise in a specific topic because it translates back into a customer pain point. What is your personal process when you come up with, I want to interview this person, or this is a topic I want to talk about because of these customer pain points? I would love to know what that is for you.
Yeah, so maybe I can kind of give a bit of a background or context as to why I developed the podcast in the first place, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
I did it because, in all honesty, I wanted one of the kind of, I wouldn't say manifestos, but one of the things that I value internally is that I want to continually learn. And so what's the best way of doing it on a shoestring budget Well, it's to talk to other smarter people than you and to get a bit of an understanding as to how they process certain things, right? So I was like, cool. Well, everyone I interview, they're all smarter than me. I'm really, really stupid. I'm the stupid person in the room. So let me ask these kind of questions. And so that's how it all started with the Point of View podcast show that I kind of created. It initially was like you just said, like, it would start off as myself kind of talking, but then during the pandemic, I was just like, man, it sucks being by myself alone. Why don't we just have a chat with someone via Zoom, record it, and then kind of share it and see if anyone actually likes it. And funnily enough, people do like it, which is kind of cool. And then since then, it's kind of evolved kind of a few, maybe similar to yourself, like you do a few episodes and then you kind of go, oh, okay, I'm kind of doing everything, but how do I kind of start to narrow things down a little bit? And as you start to talk to guests and you see their process and you see their success, and then you kind of ask them after the show, oh, like, how does you run your business in X, Y, Z? And one of the kind of, I guess, the key things that I see when I talk to all my guests, especially lately now, is about, well, how do I become a little bit more segmented in my approach? So how do I go a little bit more niche, right? So it used to be I talk about everything and everyone, and you have to, right, when you start your podcast. But then as it evolves and as your viewership evolves, then you want to go, all right, well, what do I exactly want to talk about? Well, I want to talk about leadership, branding, marketing, and sales. Okay, great. So how do I find them? And you find you go in, you research like you're doing right now. You're doing the research on LinkedIn. You find the professional kind of background on it, and then you develop a key theme. So one of the things like I had a vein with sales for some reason. And so it just resonated with people on LinkedIn and a few others, right? A few other platforms I was using. And I was like, all right, well, let's just make the questions simple and then just have a conversation around it. Because I think if you try to be too prescriptive in your questions, it freaks people out. Because you also got to remember, like, people who are going to talk to you in front of the camera, they may actually not be camera trained, or they may not actually be comfortable in front of the camera, even though we're 2022 or beyond if you're listening to it afterwards. And we're used to talking in front of a camera now. But back then, like in 2020, it was hard. Like, people weren't used to it. And they were like, oh, I actually have a camera. And they're like looking in front of it. And it's just like, dude, just step back. I can see you, or just put on, have decent audio. Like, don't worry about how you look, just have decent audio. And then you just kind of progress and get better through there. But, once you kind of go a little bit more niche, and then you kind of make the questions generic, and then have a conversation around it, it makes it a lot easier. And people want to share. This is especially like if you're coming in to them with a sense that you really want to learn from them, and they can see that. Like, maybe it's hard for the first like 10 episodes because they don't know who you are. So you're kind of asking them for a bit of a favor, and you're hoping that your personal stuff that you put out already on your LinkedIn profile or whatever resonates enough so that they're like, oh, okay, this guy seems genuine enough. Let's have a conversation. Yeah, he's starting out. Cool. Let me do my social good for the month. Let me just help him out. And then after a while, when you get better at it, then you're just like, oh, okay, cool. What exactly do I want to talk about? Okay, I want to talk about sales. All right, what exactly do I want to talk about sales? Well, I want to talk about rejection. I want to talk about methodology. And I want to talk about like a key thing at the end. Like, what is a key advice that you would give if you were to talk to one of your clients who may be a chief sales officer on improving, your sales, increasing like the sales revenue from each of your sales team, stuff like that. And and that I think that for me has kind of created that evolution and process.
There is so much in that I could probably unpack, where we've got, yes, it's about being a lifelong learner. And this is how we can use content-based networking. So there's a term from Sweetfish Media where we have people on, we're building relationships as two-way value. It ends up being three-way value, where the guest gets essentially exposure to a new audience. I get to ask the questions that I want to ask them to, and then the audience gets to hear expertise from essentially an expert. And in that, I find if you come at it from an approach of I want to learn and I genuinely want to find out more from someone who has essentially dedicated a lot of their time and effort into that space, it can remove a lot of imposter syndrome where I can feel like a fraud. Like I go through it a lot, especially in business, because a lot of the time, and this I had come across this in a recent podcast, where imposter syndrome can usually stem from when we deem ourselves an expert. And what happens is when we deem ourselves an expert, there is this constant anxiety and flurry of, I don't know everything, and everything is constantly evolving. Like think of doctors, where medicine was like 10, 15, 20 years ago, or even just the practices. They have changed drastically. And I'm curious to know from your standpoint, how has imposter syndrome been for you, whether it's through having a business or through podcasting, and how have you navigated through that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I shriek when people call me like, oh, he's Andy. This is guys, this is Andy, the digital guru. And I'm like, not a guru. Like, and also I think being Asian, we're taught, especially, by our parents and stuff, to have humility with ability. And also that's kind of drummed in as well. Like when I was working for 3 Mobile or Hutchison or Vodafone, as everyone might know now. That was one of like their core kind of things, humility with ability. And that kind of resonated with me. And so when I see that, and also because not a lot of people know this, but I used to be an athlete. I used to be a boxer. And so I did it for a long, long time. And I got to a pretty high level. And you're taught very early on, anyone who does martial arts, whether it's jujitsu, whether it's karate, whether it's boxing, you're told to actually put your ego at the door and just learn. And over time, you know how to turn things on and turn things off, and how to push things, and how to be the bully or bully the bully if you need to be in the gym. But that takes time. And so at the very beginning, you're always just putting that ego aside and just coming in with that approach, that humility with ability. And yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean you get it right the first time, and you shouldn't get it right all the time, because if you get it right all the time, you're Nostradamus. Like you should quit your job and just hit up Gold Lotto or Powerball, whatever, and just kind of bet on everything, and you'll win, right? If you know everything. Because you don't know everything, it's about just understanding, taking the time. But also, I think what's really, really important in terms of that imposter syndrome, and then kind of building that ego or putting ego to the side and building that credibility internally in yourself, is also having good teachers around you, good and bad teachers. Because I think you got to have good teachers to obviously know how to navigate in certain things, whether or not it's conflict, internal conflict. So you might have people who are watching or listening who work in large organizations, who works in large offices. There's multi-teams, you're working cross-functionally, and you're dealing with a lot of personalities, and not everyone's going to gel. And that's why a lot of large organizations, they spend a lot of time really, especially if you're in that middle to senior management and above, a lot of time just understanding like your psychographics and educating you to say that, you have this type of personality, which means you're going to have a lot of conflict with that type of personality. But it's not to say you need to change and be this kind of, I don't know, this different person altogether. It just means like, okay, this is how you're going to try and navigate your way through it. This is how you deal with talking to people who are this type of personality. Who, you might be a shy, timid type of person, and then you have someone in the team who's very boisterous, who's very loud, who's very like they'll push you if they really want to, and you feel like you're getting bullied, right? So there's different ways of kind of navigating that through. So I think to answer that question, like just putting that ego at the door, humility with ability, and I think that allows, and then showing your personal elements, because at the end of the day, people buy from you. So Tofe, people want to come on to your podcast because they like you and they see the profile, like they see what you've done and like, all right, cool. This guy's legit. but let me just get to know this person, right? And it's the way you communicate from. It doesn't even have to be verbal. It doesn't even have to be like visual. It could just be like the way you type it. If is it aggressive? Is it standoffish? Does it come across as like, this is like copy and paste? So there's all these things that come in, and it takes a bit of time to understand that as well. So I hope that kind of answers your question a little bit.
It does. The humility with ability. I've never heard that, and it makes a lot of sense. And I can see in with your work as well, man. Like you're very humble, and in the 15-year span that you've had in marketing and digital, I feel like I've known you for a little bit, but I've only known you for half an hour. So there's a lot of, it's like you've evolved through that, but keeping the ego at the door. So I resonate with the martial arts thing. I remember when I did Muay Thai for 6 months, I just got the shit kicked out of me the whole time. My shins look like, oh my gosh, they're broken glass by the end of it. And I found like the best fighters that would actually go to personally train in fights, and some of them like were world class. They were the nicest people and the kindest people too. So they were able to go, yep, and never let that get to them. And it's just that constant life learning from that. And based on what I was just saying then too, it's just sparked a question is, because you started, it was like, I think it's the term pandemic project. That's why I'm seeing a lot of podcasts are coming from that 2020 era, whether it's someone where they were bored or something like, you know what, I'm actually going to do that thing I've always wanted to do now that I've got more time. What is the best opportunity that's come from podcasting for you?
Like I said before, the best opportunity for me is get to meet people who are smarter than me, and being able to use a digital platform like this, or Zoom, or whatever, or Google Meet, to be able to talk to them, have a conversation with them that I would not have otherwise. So some of the people on my guests, like I would not have been able to chat to them had it not been for the pandemic. And by having that pandemic, it seriously messed up everyone's business, and in some cases it shut down other people's businesses, and their livelihoods like kind of got turned upside down. But for me, it just enabled me to kind of shift certain things and accelerate others that I thought, I've got a longer window of kind of getting towards that. But now it's like, oh crap, I need to start accelerating towards it. But it's also like, I think health. So that, I think you talked about mental health before, like in terms of what you have done. And so I think this whole pandemic and stuff, I think you got to have the right mentality. So getting something out of it, having a chance to talk to all these people that you don't get a chance to talk to, that's great. But it's also building that internal resilience and that mindset. And part of that is not only practicing mentally, like just, whatever, listening, meditating, whatever, or like the physical sense, going to the gym, getting your butt off, lift some weights, hit the bags, that kind of stuff. And then pushing yourself. And then also me, I'm a small business in a sense. I'm independent, so I don't have these like big backers on me. And you just got to push, man. You got to push. And you got to have a mentality. You got to almost have a fighting dog mentality. You got to be able to push through. And you got to be smart. So it's not just about working hard, but it's also about working hard and smart at the same time. And you don't know what you don't know until you do it, right? And then you find out like, oh, it's like editing process. Like, the first time you edited a podcast, or the first time, anyone does like an EDM in their marketing realm, like it took forever. And then you get better at it. And then you find out tricks to like speed certain things up whilst keeping quality at a certain pace. And so I think that just comes down to experience, but also then what will help you narrow that gap of learning is also having good teachers around you. And that's whether or not they come to you or you find them.
Yeah. I hear a lot of insatiable curiosity that comes from that. And the inverse of that is expectations. I feel expectations, outcomes can almost be a cancer for myself. And as long as and then it ends up being I'm metaphorically bashing my head against the wall, because deadlines are also what push me. So I think there is a self-awareness piece in that. and it's still something I'm trying to get better at. But what I want to say here, Andrew, is as I start to wrap things off, I do want to say thank you for jumping on the show, man. I know it was, I had seen your stuff and there was obviously a correlation. I'm glad we had this conversation, got to know a little bit more about you and especially your expertise in marketing and digital. And I'm sure we'll probably have another conversation later on to follow up this. But I feel the audience will get a lot of value from this. Where can they get in touch with you? This is obviously an opportunity for you to plug your services.
Yeah, thank you so much. So for anyone who wants to reach out to me, hit me up on my LinkedIn. I'm the most active there. Just type in Andrew Tran. Or if you want to check out my podcast, it's called The Point of View Show. Just type that in, Point of View. You can find it on all of podcast channels like Spotify, Apple, all that kind of stuff. Or just hit me up on my website, andrewtran.asia. You can find all this stuff, find a little bit about me, and just hit me up anytime. I'm down for a chat, both virtual and physical.
Amazing. Well, last question, which I ask every guest, is what is the number one piece of advice you could give to a podcaster starting out?
The number one piece of advice that I would give to a podcaster just starting out is just start. I know it sounds super generic, but just start. And just find something that you like, whether or not it's like, oh, I want to talk about mental health, or I want to talk about food in Asia, or I want to talk about my ancestral heritage, which is a big thing, like that you hear a lot. Asian Australian, Asian American. I think this generation now, like Gen Z, and then kind of like the millennials and stuff, like that I'm in as well. Like we're starting to really kind of discover. And we'll probably discover it in our 20s, but now like you're seeing this awareness happening earlier, like in the teens and stuff, that you're seeing a lot in Gen Zs. And I think that's really cool and that's really important because, at the end of the day, yes, we speak in English because we live in Australia or we live in America, but we also have a heritage and we've got a cool heritage as well. We're Asian, right? Or, whatever, we're Chinese, we're Filipino. And that's a really cool heritage, man. And whether or not, like, it doesn't even have to be Asian. Like you can be German, you can have like full on, Viking blood in you. It's cool. It's cool to have that. And I know as you're growing up, you're trying to figure out how to fit in, but as you get older, you want to stand out. And part of standing out is knowing who you are. And, that going back down to the podcast bit, just figure out any subject you want, start talking about it. You can chop and change. There's no rules whatsoever. And you'll get better at it. You go on other people's podcasts, you see how their processes are all done. You'll learn from that. I've done that. I'm on another friend of mine's podcast, which is kind of based here in Vietnam as well. And they kind of talk about pop culture here in Vietnam. I'm on there. I see how he does it, his process. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's like way more professional than mine. I've got to like step my game up, so there's stuff like that, man. Just have fun. It's a journey. It's not the destination. It's the journey.
Oh yeah, that comes back down to expectations, doesn't it? And there's a lot in that. I feel curiosity and like if you look back at say a year ago and to where you are now, think of like how many lessons you've gotten for yourself or the skills that you've had, like knowing how to ask questions, better questions, knowing how to interview. This is just from podcasting and the relationships, which comes back down to the best opportunity that you've had from the people we meet. And we're social creatures. It doesn't matter. Like I'm very introverted, but I still enjoy meeting people because I have a value of connectedness too. So that's what I got from that. So yeah, man, thank you for sharing all that.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Tofe. And for anyone who's watching, listening, I hope you guys get some value on it. And looking forward to the next time we're on.
Thanks, brother.
Thank you for listening. And for more information about Soundboard services, please check out the show notes. Lastly, Soundboard acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, paying respects to elders past, present, and emerging.